Russia is burning, not metaphorically, literally. Air bases reduced to smoldering wreckage, oil refineries erupting in columns of black smoke visible from miles away, drone strikes landing deep inside Russian territory, in cities and installations that Moscow swore were beyond any enemy's reach. What you are witnessing is not a series of lucky strikes or isolated incidents. What you are witnessing is the systematic, deliberate, and increasingly effective dismantling of Russia's self-proclaimed military invincibility, carried out by a nation that, just 4 years ago, the world had largely written off as incapable of meaningful resistance. And what makes this story truly extraordinary is not just that Ukraine survived. It's that Ukraine learned, adapted, and ultimately took the war to Russia's doorstep with a precision and strategic coherence that no Western analyst fully anticipated. By March 2026, Russia's own Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu, the former defense minister who once stood at the right hand of Vladimir Putin projecting confidence and military dominance, was forced to publicly admit that no region of Russia could consider itself safe. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who helped plan this invasion is now conceding on record that the country he serves is entirely exposed. That is not a minor diplomatic admission. That is a strategic confession of catastrophic proportions. But to truly understand how Russia arrived at this point, we must go back to the beginning, because this unraveling did not happen overnight. It was built brick by brick, strike by strike, over the course of years. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, the military calculus, at least on paper, appeared to favor Moscow overwhelmingly. Russia possessed one of the largest standing armies on the planet, with nearly 1 million active-duty personnel, thousands of main battle tanks, tens of thousands of armored fighting vehicles, vast stockpiles of Soviet-era munitions, and a strategic bomber fleet capable of delivering cruise missiles across enormous distances. Its air force and naval forces were among the most formidable in the world, and its defense budget had been steadily climbing for over a decade under Putin's deliberate militarization of the Russian state. Ukraine, by contrast, was considered by most military observers to be a second-tier regional power at best. It had inherited certain Soviet-era assets after the dissolution of the USSR, but decades of institutional neglect, corruption, and underinvestment had left its armed forces in a state of disrepair. Most serious analysts did not foresee Ukraine's military being capable of anything beyond a limited territorial defense, and even that, many expected to collapse within days or weeks under the sheer weight of Russian firepower. The very notion of Ukrainian forces striking Russian soil, hitting Russian infrastructure, or threatening Russian cities was, at the time, treated as fantasy. It was simply not a scenario that most defense establishments in the West or East were modeling with any real seriousness. That assumption, that comfortable, condescending assumption, was about to be shattered. The earliest signs emerged not with fanfare, but with whispers. In the months following the invasion, scattered reports began to surface of unusual incidents inside Russian territory, explosions near fuel depots in the Belgorod region, fires breaking out at facilities close to the Ukrainian border, mysterious disruptions to rail infrastructure that Russia depended on to funnel supplies and ammunition to its advancing forces. Many of these incidents were unconfirmed in the early stages, and some were even suspected of being staged or exaggerated by Kremlin-aligned media to manufacture a sense of victimhood and stoke domestic outrage against Ukraine. But not all of them. Some were real, and some were not the work of Ukrainian military forces at all, but rather of Russian citizens themselves, anti-war saboteurs operating under groups like Stop the Wagons, who deliberately destroyed sections of their own country's rail network to delay the logistical flow of war material to the front. What this revealed, even in its early, fragmented form, was something deeply significant. Russia was not going to escape this war unscathed, regardless of what its propagandists were telling the population on state television. The cracks were already forming, and they were forming from within as much as from without. But this is only the beginning of how Russia's assumed immunity began to collapse. By the end of 2022, Ukraine had graduated from covert disruption to confirmed offensive action on Russian soil. On December 5th of that year, Ukrainian forces executed strikes on two of Russia's most strategically important air installations, the Engels Air Base in the Saratov region and the Diaghilevo Air Base near Ryazan. These were not frontline facilities. These were deep rear bases, hundreds of miles from the Ukrainian border, housing some of Russia's most advanced and valuable strategic aircraft, including the Tupolev Tu-95, a Cold War-era strategic bomber that had been used extensively to launch cruise missile attacks against Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure. The strikes caused confirmed damage to both aircraft and supporting infrastructure, sending shockwaves through the Russian military establishment and, perhaps more importantly, through the Kremlin's political leadership. Then, on December 26th, Engels was struck again, a follow-up strike, deliberate, methodical, a signal to Moscow that the first attack had not been a fluke, that Ukraine possessed both the capability and the intention to reach deep into Russian territory and hit high-value targets. For the first time since the invasion began, Russia felt the war on its own ground, not on Ukraine's. That psychological shift, though difficult to quantify, carried enormous strategic weight, and what happened next would accelerate that shift dramatically. The year 2023 marked a genuine turning point in the character and complexity of this conflict. For much of the war's opening phase, the fighting had resembled a grinding, attritional struggle reminiscent of earlier 20th century conflicts. Russian armor advancing in columns, Ukrainian defenders establishing fortified lines, artillery duels across vast stretches of contested terrain. It was brutal, costly, and slow-moving. But warfare was evolving in real time on this battlefield, and the instrument driving that evolution was the unmanned aerial vehicle, the drone. Russia had been employing Iranian-supplied Shahed drones with increasing regularity since late 2022, deploying them in large swarms to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses and strike civilian infrastructure, power grids, and frontline positions. These were cheap, mass-producible, and extraordinarily difficult to intercept in volume. They created enormous strain on Ukraine's air defense networks and caused widespread destruction across the country. But Ukraine, as it had done throughout this war, did not simply absorb the punishment, it studied it. It reverse-engineered the concept, it built its own domestic drone industry from the ground up, and with remarkable speed it began deploying indigenous systems that would soon surpass its adversaries in both sophistication and strategic effect. On May 3, 2023, the world got its first clear look at what Ukraine's expanding drone capability could do at range. Several Ukrainian drones struck a Russian airfield in the Bryansk region, destroying assets and demonstrating an ever-increasing operational reach. But it was the other event of that same day that captured global attention most dramatically. Drones appeared over Moscow. They struck near the Kremlin itself, the symbolic and administrative heart of the Russian state, home to the government of Vladimir Putin, center of political power in a country that had spent decades projecting an image of untouchable strength. And though the physical damage was limited, the strategic and psychological impact was seismic. A nation that had not faced an attack on its capital in living memory had just been reached by the weapons of a neighbor it had invaded and expected to subdue within weeks. Later that month, 8 more drones entered Moscow's airspace. Ukraine, less than a year and a half into a war it was not supposed to survive, was striking the Russian capital nearly 500 kilometers from its borders. If anyone in Moscow had still been dismissing Ukraine's offensive potential, that dismissal ended on those days in May 2023. What happens next changes everything in terms of how this war is fought and who holds the strategic initiative. The ground dimension of Ukraine's cross-border campaign opened a new and equally significant chapter in late spring of 2023, when armed formations crossed into the Russian region of Belgorod in what constituted the first major ground incursion into Russian territory since the invasion began. The forces involved were largely composed of anti-Kremlin Russian volunteer fighters, members of formations such as the Freedom of Russia Legion, alongside other foreign combatants who had joined Ukraine's cause. This was not a Ukrainian territorial seizure. It was a deliberate tactical operation designed to stretch Russian defensive resources, disrupt supply lines, and expose the vulnerability of Russia's border regions to ground-level penetration. Its effect on Russian military morale was significant. For months, Russian soldiers had been told they were liberators, heroes carrying out a noble mission, to protect Russian-speaking populations from a hostile Western-backed regime in Kiev. They had been assured that their special military operation would be swift, decisive, and welcomed. Instead, they were now confronted with the reality that enemy forces had physically breached Russia's sovereign borders and were operating inside the country's own territory. The psychological dislocation that produced among Russian troops and the Russian civilian population was profound, and it planted a seed of doubt in the Kremlin's narrative that no amount of state media propaganda could fully uproot. The war, which Putin had promised would be a controlled, limited operation, was spiraling in directions that Moscow had neither planned for nor was prepared to manage, and it was about to escalate further still. As 2023 gave way to 2024, the Kremlin placed enormous hope in what it anticipated would be a decisive year, a year in which Russian forces, bolstered by months of mobilization, reconstitution, and materiel replenishment, would finally break Ukraine's defenses and force a resolution on Moscow's terms. That calculation proved to be spectacularly wrong. Rather than buckling under renewed Russian pressure, Ukraine entered 2024 with a more refined, more strategic, and more operationally sophisticated approach to the conflict than at any previous point. Kiev's commanders made a crucial doctrinal shift in their targeting philosophy, one that would have lasting and accelerating consequences for Russia's ability to sustain its war effort. They began to focus their drone and missile campaigns with greater precision on Russia's energy and oil infrastructure. This was not a random or opportunistic decision. It was a well-reasoned strategic choice rooted in a clear-eyed understanding of Russia's economic vulnerabilities. Oil and gas revenues constitute the financial backbone of the Russian state. They fund not only general government expenditures, but the direct costs of the war itself: soldier pay, equipment procurement, weapons production, and logistical sustainment. Degrade that revenue stream, and you degrade the Kremlin's capacity to fight. It was a strategy aimed not merely at military targets, but at the economic engine driving Russian aggression, and it was executed with growing effectiveness throughout 2024. Over the course of that year, Ukrainian forces conducted at least 84 confirmed strikes on Russian oil infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, and storage facilities distributed across multiple regions of the country. The cumulative damage was substantial. Refining capacity was reduced, export flows were disrupted, insurance costs for Russian energy shipments spiked, and the financial toll began to compound, straining a Russian economy that was already operating under the weight of sweeping Western sanctions. Simultaneously, Ukraine's domestic defense industry was achieving production milestones that would have seemed implausible just 18 months earlier. Neptune cruise missiles were being deployed in increasing numbers, striking targets well within Russian territory. Long-range drone strikes were reaching targets nearly 1,000 miles from Ukraine's borders, including the Kupol electromechanical plant in the Izhevsk region, a facility integral to Russian defense electronics production. Ukraine's Western allies, meanwhile, made a decision of considerable strategic importance. They authorized Kiev to use foreign-supplied weapons, including British Storm Shadow cruise missiles and American long-range munitions, to strike targets inside Russia itself, not merely within the occupied Ukrainian territories. This removed a critical self-imposed constraint on Ukraine's offensive reach and dramatically expanded the menu of viable targets available to Ukrainian planners. Russia had more to fear than ever before, and the worst was yet to come. The naval dimension of Ukraine's campaign deserves particular attention because it represents one of the most consequential and underappreciated strategic achievements of this entire conflict. Beginning with the sinking of the Moskva, the flagship cruiser of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, in April 2022, Ukraine prosecuted a sustained and remarkably effective maritime campaign against Russian naval forces operating in and around the Black Sea. Landing ships, missile vessels, patrol boats, and even submarines were struck, damaged, or destroyed over the months and years that followed. The accumulated damage was so severe that Russian naval commanders ultimately made the decision to withdraw the bulk of the Black Sea Fleet from its traditional forward operating positions near Crimea, repositioning vessels to ports farther from Ukrainian strike range. This withdrawal had consequences that extended far beyond the purely military domain. By reducing the Russian naval threat in the western Black Sea, Ukraine was able to reopen maritime corridors for the export of grain and other agricultural commodities, a development of global economic significance, given Ukraine's role as one of the world's leading food exporters. It also demonstrated something strategically fundamental, that a smaller, technologically adaptive nation, properly resourced and sufficiently determined, could neutralize a significantly larger naval force through asymmetric means. And it set the stage for what would become one of the most audacious and consequential military operations of the entire war. On August 6, 2024, Ukraine executed an operation that redefined the boundaries of what this war had become. In the early morning hours, Ukrainian armored formations crossed the border into Russia's Kursk region, not as an act of territorial conquest, but as a calculated strategic maneuver designed to fundamentally disrupt Russian operational planning and force a reallocation of resources that Moscow could ill afford. The Kursk incursion was bold, it was unexpected, and in its opening phase, it was devastatingly effective. Russian border defenses in the area were thin, undermanned, and wholly unprepared for a conventional ground assault of this scale and speed. Ukrainian forces moved quickly, seizing towns and villages, capturing Russian soldiers, destroying equipment, and establishing a military presence across more than 80 settlements inside Russian sovereign territory. For the first time in modern history, a foreign army had crossed into Russia and held ground, not for days, but for months. Ukraine maintained its presence in Kursk until March 2025, when commanders made the deliberate and professionally sound decision to withdraw, having achieved the operation's core objectives. Russia attempted to frame the eventual Ukrainian withdrawal as a victory. The reality was precisely the opposite. The Kursk incursion had forced the Kremlin to divert critical combat power away from active front lines in Ukraine, buying Kiev's defenders time to reconstitute, reposition, and reinforce in sectors that had been under severe pressure. It had also exposed before the entire watching world the fundamental hollowness of Russia's border security and the limits of its ability to protect its own territory. Putin had promised his people a war of liberation fought on foreign soil. Kursk proved that the war had come home and that Russia lacked the capacity to keep it out. And it gets even more serious from here. If 2024 demonstrated Ukraine's growing strategic maturity, then 2025 announced its arrival as a genuinely formidable offensive power. The year opened with a mass drone strike on Moscow involving 240 unmanned aerial vehicles launched simultaneously from Ukrainian territory, targeting military installations and energy infrastructure across multiple Russian regions in a single coordinated wave. This was not improvisation. This was industrial-scale drone warfare executed with a level of planning, coordination, and logistical depth that reflected years of accumulated experience and rapidly expanding production capacity. Ukraine had, by this point, transformed its domestic drone industry into one of the most productive and innovative in the world. Monthly production figures that had stood at approximately 20,000 units in the early phases of the war had climbed to 200,000 by 2025, a tenfold increase representing an extraordinary feat of wartime industrial mobilization. And these were not the simple rudimentary systems of earlier years. Ukraine's drone arsenal had diversified into a sophisticated ecosystem of long-range strike platforms, electronic warfare variants, and precision-guided systems capable of penetrating layered air defense networks and hitting targets with remarkable accuracy at distances that continued to grow. Strike after strike, Russia's most valued military and economic assets came under attack: air defense radars, command and control nodes, ammunition depots, military production facilities, and above all, oil infrastructure, the financial lifeblood of Putin's war machine. Ukraine's strikes on Russian energy assets cost the Kremlin an estimated $12 billion through 2025 alone, as refineries burned, pipelines ruptured, and production capacity was systematically degraded across region after region. Then came Operation Spiderweb, arguably the most tactically ingenious and strategically significant single operation Ukraine has conducted in this entire war. On June 1, 2025, after more than a year of meticulous planning, Ukrainian intelligence and special operations personnel executed a strike of breathtaking audacity. Dozens of drones had been covertly concealed inside ordinary commercial trucks, which were then positioned at carefully selected locations across Russian territory, directly adjacent to major strategic airbase installations housing Russia's nuclear-capable bomber fleet. At the designated moment, the trucks opened, and the drone swarms were released simultaneously across multiple sites, overwhelming local air defenses and raining destruction down on aircraft that Russia considered among its most irreplaceable military assets. The results were devastating. Assessments indicated that approximately one-third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet was destroyed or severely damaged in a single day of operations, an extraordinary attrition of high-value platforms representing billions of dollars in military capital and decades of industrial investment. No conventional military operation, no matter how well resourced, could have achieved a comparable result at comparable cost. Operation Spiderweb was asymmetric warfare at its most refined, and it sent a message to every military establishment on the planet. The age of assuming that strategic assets are protected by distance alone is over. As 2026 arrived, Ukraine showed no indication of reducing the tempo or ambition of its campaign. Quite the contrary. In February, Ukrainian strikes hit Russia's missile fuel production plant in the Tver region, a facility integral to the sustainment of Moscow's ballistic missile inventory. In March, a factory producing microchips and missile components was struck, targeting the industrial supply chain that feeds Russian weapons production at its source. Ukraine's domestically developed Flamingo long-range missile began appearing with increasing regularity, striking the Kapustin Yar test range and then the Votkinsk plant, one of the cornerstone facilities of the Russian defense industrial complex. On the night of March 8th, Ukraine launched 754 drones in a single overnight operation, the largest drone strike in the history of the conflict, dispatching swarms across Russian airspace that penetrated air defense screens and struck targets spread across dozens of regions simultaneously. In late March, Ukraine struck several of Russia's most critical oil export terminals on the Baltic Sea, igniting large-scale fires and causing disruption to energy export infrastructure on a scale that sent shockwaves through global energy markets. The Russian economy, already laboring under the combined burden of Western sanctions, war expenditure, and accumulated strike damage, began to show signs of serious structural strain. The Central Bank of Russia was compelled to raise interest rates to record levels in an attempt to contain inflation driven by military spending and supply disruption. Ordinary Russian citizens, the same population that state media had spent years assuring that the special military operation was going smoothly, began feeling the cost of Putin's gamble in their daily lives through rising prices, reduced public services, and the steady drain of sons and husbands into a war that showed no sign of resolution. The strategic picture that emerges from this four-year arc is unambiguous. Russia entered this war expecting a swift, low-cost victory against an adversary it fundamentally underestimated. Instead, it has found itself trapped in a war of attrition that it is losing on multiple dimensions simultaneously, militarily, economically, industrially, and in terms of international standing. Ukraine's drone production is projected to reach between 5 and 10 million units in 2026. Its missile development programs are delivering new capabilities on an accelerating timeline. Its targeting intelligence has grown sharper, its strike coordination more sophisticated, and its operational planning more strategically coherent with every passing month. Shoigu's admission that no region of Russia can feel safe is not merely a statement of current vulnerability, it is a forecast. Because if this trajectory continues, and there is every indication that it will, the pressure on Russia's economy, its military capacity, and its political cohesion will only intensify. Putin wagered everything on Ukraine's collapse. Ukraine did not collapse. It fought back. It innovated. It brought the war home. And now, the nation that launched this invasion is the one being forced to defend its own soil, its own cities, its own infrastructure against an adversary it once dismissed as inconsequential. History will record that miscalculation as one of the most catastrophic strategic failures of the 21st century.